He lived his life between two worlds, one of loyalty, the other of betrayal. His name was Hans-Thilo Schmidt, a middle-aged bureaucrat working quietly within the heart of the German military machine. To his superiors, he was unremarkable, polite, disciplined, methodical. But beneath the gray uniform and tired eyes lay a secret that would one day help alter the fate of nations. Long before the world had heard the name Enigma, before war set Europe on fire, this man had already begun his private war, one fought not with guns, but with secrets. Schmidt had been raised in a Germany wounded by defeat. The scars of the First World War marked his youth, humiliation, poverty, and the slow decay of national pride. He served his country faithfully, but like many of his generation, he saw promises broken and ideals twisted. When Hitler rose to power, Schmidt was not seduced by the frenzy of nationalism, he saw in it something darker, something dangerous. Still, he stayed where he was, buried in paperwork within the German Defense Ministry, quietly watching as the new Reich wrapped itself in symbols and lies. By 1931, Schmidt had been assigned to the Cipher Office of the German Army, a modest title that masked extraordinary access. His job involved handling documentation related to a new encryption machine, the Enigma. Designed to render communications unbreakable, it was a marvel of German engineering, a box of whirring rotors, wires, and lights capable of producing millions of coded combinations. Only a handful of officers knew its workings. Schmidt was one of them. He should have been a patriot guarding his nation's crown jewel of secrecy. Instead, he found himself consumed by bitterness. His career had stalled, promotions had passed him by. He was drowning in debt, humiliated by his own failures, overshadowed by his more successful brother, Rudolf, a respected diplomat. Pride, desperation, and disillusionment fused into a single thought that would change history. If Germany would not value him, perhaps someone else would. In the autumn of 1931, Schmidt crossed a line few dared even to imagine. He reached out, not to an enemy, but to a future one, offering to sell German military secrets to French intelligence. The French, cautious but intrigued, arranged a meeting in Luxembourg. It was there, in a hotel room lit by a single lamp, that a weary German official slid a stack of documents across the table and named his price, 10,000 marks. What the French officer, known by the codename Rex, held in his hands were not mere papers, but the keys to Germany's most secure communications system. For years, historians would debate Schmidt's motive. Was it greed, revenge, or conscience? Perhaps all three. But whatever his reasons, that act of betrayal would ripple across Europe. The French would share his information with their allies in Poland, where a team of young mathematicians began the impossible task of decoding Enigma. Their success would later pass to the British at Bletchley Park, where men like Alan Turing would build on it to turn the tide of war. And yet, as Schmidt returned to Berlin, no one suspected a thing. The man who had handed over the soul of Germany's military machine simply resumed his desk job, greeting his colleagues as if nothing had happened. He would go on working in the same office for nearly a decade, quietly feeding secrets to the enemy from the very heart of the Reich. The French called him Asha, the man made of ashes, because he lived as if already burned by what he had done. But the truth was far greater than even he understood. The unremarkable clerk inside the WWII had just set in motion one of the greatest intelligence coups in modern history. The decision to betray his country had not come suddenly. For Hans-Thilo Schmidt, it was the slow erosion of faith, a loss measured in years of frustration and disappointment. He had served the German army faithfully, but the Reich rewarded loyalty with disdain. His pay barely covered his debts, his family life was unraveling. The old comrades from the First World War had become strangers, many now enthralled by the promises of Adolf Hitler. Schmidt saw their eyes, burning with fanaticism, and felt only dread. He was a man out of time, watching his nation slide into madness. By 1931, he was desperate. His position in the Cipher Office of the Reichswehr gave him access to sensitive materials, new encryption systems, security manuals, and classified codes. When the Enigma machine arrived, he recognized at once what it represented, a weapon of secrecy unlike anything before. It was a small, clattering device with rotating discs, wires, and lights, but in its mechanical heart lay the future of war. Messages sent through Enigma could not be read without another machine calibrated with identical settings. Each day, those settings changed. To the German military, it was unbreakable. To Schmidt, it was opportunity. He had already begun to think of himself as a man standing between two fates. On one side was the bureaucracy that had crushed him, on the other, the dangerous freedom of betrayal. The choice came easily when a French intelligence officer, operating under the codename Rex, made contact through Schmidt's brother, Rudolf, then stationed at the German embassy in Paris. The French had been searching for information about Germany's rearmament, and when word reached them of a disillusioned official inside the cipher office, they moved quickly. The first meeting took place in the quiet of a Luxembourg hotel. Schmidt arrived by train, carrying a briefcase filled with Enigma manuals, operating instructions, and key lists, documents so secret that even generals rarely saw them. He expected suspicion, perhaps arrest. Instead, the French officer greeted him politely, offered him a cigarette, and asked simple questions: how the machine worked, how the codes were changed, who controlled the cipher network. Schmidt answered with the calm precision of a bureaucrat. He spoke not as a spy, but as a man explaining his daily work. When the meeting ended, he accepted an envelope of cash and returned to Berlin as if nothing had happened. The French couldn't believe their luck. In one night, they had acquired the technical foundation of Germany's most advanced cryptographic system. Within weeks, the documents were on the desks of the Bureau du Chiffre, the French code-breaking agency. The experts realized what they had, but also what they didn't. The Enigma machine was complex beyond expectation. Without a working model, the French couldn't yet read its messages. So they made a choice of their own. To share Schmidt's intelligence with their Polish allies, whose mathematicians had a reputation for brilliance. Schmidt, meanwhile, continued his double life. He met his handlers in cafes and train stations, passing envelopes, whispering updates, always careful to appear dull and forgettable. His colleagues in the Abwehr joked that he was the most boring man in the office. It was the perfect disguise. The Gestapo never suspected that the quiet clerk with thinning hair and tired eyes was the most dangerous traitor in Germany. For the next 8 years, Schmidt's betrayal would feed the Allies a stream of priceless secrets, all from within the walls of the Reich itself. Each document he passed carried enormous risk. Yet every success only pulled him deeper into the labyrinth. The French paid him well, but his motives had already shifted. He no longer did it for money, but for revenge, against a nation that had betrayed him first. The second meeting took place in early 1932, and by then, the French knew exactly what they had: a direct line into the German military's most secret brain. Schmidt arrived at the same hotel in Luxembourg, his manner calm and deliberate, as though he were attending a business conference. He carried another briefcase, this one heavier than before. Inside were updated cipher tables, message keys, and the newest instruction booklets for the Enigma network used by the Reichswehr. To his French contact, codenamed Rex, he handed the papers wordlessly, as though it were a transaction between colleagues rather than the most dangerous act of espionage in Europe. When Rex examined the documents, he realized the enormity of what Schmidt was doing. The papers contained everything needed to reconstruct the workings of the Enigma machine: rotor wiring, plug board configurations, and the procedures for changing settings. For the first time, the Allies could see how the machine truly functioned. It was like opening the skull of the German war machine and peering directly into its mind. But Schmidt was no professional spy. He was nervous, careless in small ways that would one day catch up to him. At one meeting, he used his real passport; at another, he lingered too long after the handoff, chatting about politics with his handler. Still, his access was so valuable that the French overlooked his lack of training. They gave him the codename Asche, meaning ash, a nod to his melancholy demeanor and the grey dust of secrecy that seemed to follow him. From Berlin, Schmidt continued to feed a steady flow of secrets to Rex. He used his official position to remove documents from the cipher office at night, photograph them, and return them by morning. His work was meticulous. The photographs were smuggled out through diplomatic couriers, arriving in Paris disguised as business correspondence. Each envelope was a message from inside the enemy's soul. The information reached the French cryptographic section, led by Gustave Bertrand, a pragmatic intelligence officer who understood the value of patience. Bertrand quickly realized that while the documents revealed how Enigma worked, they did not make it readable. The daily key settings, the combinations of routers and plugboard links, changed constantly, producing billions of possible variations. It would take mathematical brilliance to break it. And so, in 1932, Bertrand made a fateful decision. He sent the materials to Poland, to the Bureau Cifro, the Cipher Bureau, where a young team of mathematicians would soon begin the work that would change the course of history. Among them was Marian Rejewski, a quiet, analytical genius who approached cryptography like a scientist solving a riddle. Using Schmidt's stolen documents as his foundation, Rejewski reverse-engineered the logic of Enigma, constructing a mathematical model of the machine itself. By the end of that year, he could read intercepted German messages. Not perfectly, but enough to glimpse the enemy's hidden pulse. The unremarkable clerk in Berlin had unknowingly given birth to one of the greatest intelligence victories of the century. Schmidt, of course, had no idea. He continued to live his double life, unaware that his stolen documents were already rippling across Europe. He spent his days typing reports and nights worrying about discovery. He had no training in tradecraft, no network of safehouses or dead drops, only his nerve. Yet somehow, for nearly a decade, he survived inside one of the most paranoid regimes in history. The irony was almost poetic. While Nazi propaganda boasted that Enigma was unbreakable, the machine's first weakness had been born not in mathematics, but in human disillusionment. The code that was supposed to guard the Reich had been betrayed by one of its own clerks, a man whose only weapons were frustration, greed, and conscience. By 1933, as Hitler consolidated power, Schmidt's position became even more perilous. The new regime purged ministries, tightened surveillance, and filled every corridor with informants. Still, the Frenchman inside the Abwehr remained invisible, a ghost in plain sight, feeding the Allies the secrets that would one day save millions. By 1933, the shadow that hung over Germany had thickened into darkness. Hitler was now chancellor, the swastika fluttered from every building, and loyalty had become a weapon sharper than any sword. Inside Berlin's ministries, fear replaced formality. The cipher office, once a quiet domain of mathematics and machines, now thrummed with tension. Every word was weighed, every glance measured. For Hans-Thilo Schmidt, the walls were closing in, yet his work as a spy had only just begun. He watched as colleagues who once dismissed Hitler now saluted him. Files vanished overnight, replaced with new orders stamped with the Black Eagle of the Third Reich. The Enigma network expanded rapidly, its use spreading from the Army to the Navy, the Air Force, and the Foreign Ministry. Schmidt's role gave him a front-row seat to the machine's evolution. He studied every change, every update, every new rotor and cable, and then passed it all to his French handlers. His meetings with Rex became riskier. The Gestapo had begun monitoring railway stations and hotels, keeping files on anyone traveling without clear purpose. Yet Schmidt persisted. He often met Rex in border cities, Luxembourg, Brussels, Zurich, always traveling under the guise of business. The briefcase never left his hand. Inside, under layers of official documents, lay the details of Germany's encryption architecture. Each time, he handed over the papers with trembling fingers and forced a smile. The French continued to forward his intelligence to the Polish cryptographers, who now worked feverishly to keep up with the Reich's modifications. Each time Germany upgraded Enigma, Schmidt provided the new manuals. His betrayals kept the Allies one step ahead. Without realizing it, he had become the backbone of an entire intelligence alliance, France, Poland, and soon Britain, united by his quiet treason. Still, his life in Berlin grew unbearable. His debts mounted. His drinking worsened. He lived in a small apartment, alone and paranoid. His brother Rudolf, now a rising figure in the German military hierarchy, tried to help him, unaware of how deep his troubles ran. The irony was cruel: one Schmidt was being groomed for power, the other was feeding that power's secrets to its enemies. As the 1930s marched on, the pace of Schmidt's work increased. Hitler's speeches thundered across radio waves, promising strength and destiny, while Schmidt listened in silence, haunted by what he knew. The files on his desk contained not only technical details but the outlines of future conquest, plans for rearmament, troop movements, and new networks of encrypted communication. He copied everything he could, sometimes staying late in the office to photograph pages under the dim light of a desk lamp. Every click of the camera shutter felt like a heartbeat. French intelligence began calling him their most valuable source inside Germany. Bertrand, the spymaster who managed Schmidt's transmissions through Rex, nicknamed him our invisible engineer. But even Bertrand worried about him. Schmidt was growing erratic. At one meeting, he arrived trembling and incoherent, convinced the Gestapo had followed him. At another, he handed over the wrong briefcase before realizing his mistake. Each slip could have meant exposure and death. Yet somehow, luck stayed with him. The Gestapo's gaze was elsewhere, fixed on political dissidents and Jews. A cipher clerk, even a careless one, was beneath suspicion. Schmidt's anonymity was his greatest armor. To his co-workers, he was a dull bureaucrat; to the Allies, a savior cloaked in mediocrity. By 1938, his documents had helped the Polish team not only read Enigma messages but build replicas of the machine itself. The unbreakable code of Nazi Germany was no longer a mystery. The Frenchman inside the Abwehr had opened a door the Reich could never close. Still, he was beginning to sense the danger tightening around him. The Gestapo's intelligence division had started auditing cipher security. Intercepted leaks were being traced. If the trail ever led back to him, it would not end with interrogation, it would end with a bullet in the basement of Prinz Albrechtstrasse. Schmidt knew this, but he couldn't stop. He was trapped between duty and damnation, between survival and conscience. The man who had betrayed his country now belonged to no one, not Germany, not France, not even himself. His war had already begun, long before the world's did. By 1939, the world teetered on the edge of war. Germany had annexed Austria and swallowed Czechoslovakia. The air in Berlin was thick with triumph and fear. The city marched to the rhythm of boots and brass. Inside the cipher office, Hans-Thilo Schmidt moved among his colleagues like a ghost, carrying the weight of secrets that could end his life at any moment. He had been passing Enigma materials for 8 years now, but the game was becoming too dangerous to continue. Every train ride, every meeting, every coded message was a coin toss between survival and discovery. The Enigma machine itself had evolved. What began as a 3-rotor device now included new components and procedures, each change rendering the Allies' painstaking work obsolete. Each time the Germans improved the cipher, Schmidt had to start again, smuggling out new manuals, photographing updated key lists, stealing access to classified revisions. The job grew harder with every passing month. The Gestapo had begun conducting random checks on staff, demanding paperwork, searching bags. Suspicion had become part of daily life. When he met with his French handler Rex in Brussels that spring, Schmidt looked older, thinner. He spoke in a low, anxious tone, complaining that he was being watched. "They suspect someone," he said. "They don't know who, but it's close." Still, he handed over another set of documents, diagrams of the new military Enigma, the Wehrmacht model that would soon encrypt all German communications. "This is the last," he said quietly. "If I'm caught, tell my family I tried to do something good." The French knew the risk. Bertrand and Rex debated whether to cut him loose, but they couldn't. The material was too important. With war days away, Schmidt was their only source inside the WWII. They paid him handsomely, urging him to stay careful, to avoid contact for several months. He nodded, pocketed the money, and returned to Berlin with a face of weary resignation. Then came September 1, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and the world burst into flame. The cipher office was thrown into chaos. Enigma traffic multiplied overnight. Schmidt found himself buried in paperwork, working long hours encrypting and decrypting orders. For the first time, he could see the scale of the war machine he had helped undermine. But even as the Wehrmacht marched east, his stolen secrets were already in motion. The French had passed them again to their Polish allies. In a hidden room outside Warsaw, Rejewski and his colleagues raced to adapt their methods to the new Enigma. Days before Poland fell, they succeeded in smuggling their work in 2 replica machines to France. The foundation for Allied code-breaking had survived. Schmidt, meanwhile, remained trapped. The war had closed the borders, travel was now monitored, meetings impossible. He lived in a constant state of dread. His nerves began to fray. He drank more heavily, often appearing at work disheveled, muttering to himself. Once, a colleague asked if he was all right. He forced a laugh. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired of secrets." In 1940, the Gestapo began investigating leaks within the WWII. Schmidt's brother Rudolf, now a general in the Wehrmacht, heard whispers of an internal traitor. He visited Hans-Thilo one evening, warning him to stay quiet and keep his records clean. The irony was suffocating. Rudolf had no idea he was speaking to the very spy he feared. Meanwhile, the Enigma war entered a new phase. The Germans, confident in their machine's perfection, grew careless. The Poles' breakthroughs, passed to the British, would soon give rise to Bletchley Park, where Alan Turing and his team would transform Schmidt's documents into a weapon of mathematics. Messages once thought unreadable would become the Allies' window into the Reich. Hans-Thilo Schmidt had no way of knowing this. He worked on, trembling, sick with fear and guilt, watching his country descend into ruin. Every secret he passed had taken him one step closer to discovery, but also one step closer to redemption. He was a spy now in name and soul, a man living on borrowed time, burning his life one photograph at a time. By 1941, Berlin was at war with half the world, and Hans-Thilo Schmidt was drowning in the very machine he had helped sabotage. The Reich Cipher Office had expanded into a fortress of secrecy, dozens of departments, hundreds of clerks, and layers of surveillance designed to prevent exactly what he had been doing for a decade. He walked through its marble corridors every day, surrounded by uniforms and propaganda banners, knowing that if anyone so much as glanced into his briefcase, he would vanish without a trace. The Gestapo had grown more sophisticated. They had infiltrated every ministry, searching for disloyalty and defeatist talk. At the same time, the SS had begun auditing cipher protocols, convinced that leaks must explain why the Allies always seemed one step ahead. Schmidt's luck was running out. His nerves were frayed to the edge. He drank constantly, cheap schnapps from a bottle hidden in his desk drawer. Colleagues whispered that he was losing his mind. They weren't wrong. Yet he still found ways to deliver information. The French handlers, now working through the Vichy government, used new intermediaries and false business fronts. The war had divided France, but its intelligence network still functioned in secret, and Bertrand, his old contact, refused to abandon him. They arranged coded letters, invisible ink, and courier drops in neutral cities like Bern. Each delivery was riskier than the last. Every step outside Berlin felt like a march into the gallows. Then, in late 1942, the Gestapo began tightening its net. Reports surfaced of leaks inside the WWII, the military intelligence branch now under Admiral Canaris. Several officers were arrested, and others simply disappeared. One of them, a mid-level clerk who had once shared an office with Schmidt, was taken for questioning. When Schmidt arrived at work the next morning, the man's desk was empty. A cold fear settled over him. At home, his isolation deepened. His brother Rudolf, now a full general commanding armies on the Eastern Front, barely wrote anymore. When he did, his letters were full of despair over Hitler's leadership. Hans-Thilo wondered if Rudolf, too, was becoming disillusioned, but he dared not say so aloud. He knew that even family could not be trusted. That winter, a courier from France smuggled him a message: the Allies had broken Enigma. They did not tell him how, they couldn't risk revealing Bletchley Park, but they wanted him to know his sacrifices had not been in vain. The word struck him harder than any bullet could have. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that what he had done mattered. He had not just betrayed Germany, he had helped shorten a war that was consuming millions. Still, the knowledge brought no peace. His health was collapsing. He lived in constant paranoia, convinced that his apartment was bugged and that his phone was tapped. He often burned his notes in the middle of the night, pacing in front of the window as if expecting black cars to appear on the street below. His contact with the French dwindled. He wanted to stop, to disappear, but the war had swallowed every escape route. He was too deep. By 1943, the Gestapo's investigations reached the Cipher office directly. An internal memo ordered background checks on all employees with access to Enigma materials. When the file reached Schmidt's desk, his hands trembled so violently that he spilled coffee across the paper. Somehow, no one noticed. He signed off on his own audit, marking it approved. It was the last time his luck would save him. The next year, as the Reich began to crumble under Allied bombing, the Gestapo's search for internal traitors turned ruthless. They began cross-referencing personnel lists and old travel records. In a dusty file from 1931, a name appeared: Hans-Thilo Schmidt, who had once traveled abroad for a technical demonstration. A trace was ordered. Within weeks, his past began to surface. He didn't know it yet, but his own history was catching up to him. The man who had fooled the Reich for nearly a decade had only a few months left before his deception was finally unmasked. By 1943, the noose had begun to tighten. The war was turning against Germany, Stalingrad had fallen, the Allies had landed in Italy, and Berlin itself was now within reach of Allied bombers. Paranoia ruled the Reich. Hitler's empire was rotting from the inside, and the Gestapo had become more ruthless than ever. Every department was scoured for spies, defeatists, and traitors. Hans-Thilo Schmidt could feel the circle closing, even as he tried to convince himself he was still invisible. He looked worse than ever. The heavy drinking, the sleepless nights, and the constant fear had aged him far beyond his years. His colleagues whispered that he was ill, some even pitied him. But to the Gestapo, pity meant nothing. They were reviewing every Cipher worker's file, and Schmidt's contained just enough oddities to draw attention. His unexplained trips to Luxembourg years earlier, his constant money troubles, his nervous behavior, small things, but in the paranoid logic of the Reich, small things meant guilt. It began with a simple visit. Two men in plain coats appeared at his apartment one morning, polite but sharp-eyed. They asked a few questions about his duties, his acquaintances, his brother. He answered carefully, sweating through his collar. They smiled, thanked him, and left. But Schmidt knew. He had been marked. Over the next weeks, he noticed men following him, or perhaps he imagined them. He grew careless, speaking too loudly, drinking too much. At work, he began to make mistakes. Once, he left a document on his desk overnight, a trivial report, but still a violation. His supervisor scolded him. "You need rest, Schmidt," he said kindly. "The war is wearing on us all." Schmidt nodded, trying to smile, but inside, he was breaking. The Gestapo came back in the summer of 1943. This time, they didn't knock. They went through his papers, his drawers, his books. They found nothing, not the secret photographs, not the letters, nothing to tie him directly to espionage. Still, they detained him for routine questioning. Routine questioning in Berlin meant days of interrogation, bright lights, and no sleep. He denied everything. He was loyal, he said. He had served the Reich faithfully for years. And perhaps the Gestapo believed him, or perhaps they found something better. When they released him, he was no longer the same man. He returned to his desk pale and shaking, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. He stopped meeting his contacts, stopped writing letters, stopped sleeping. He began burning everything, notes, photographs, even old newspapers. He told a colleague, "They can't hang you if they find nothing." In the spring of 1944, the trap finally closed. The Gestapo had discovered records from the 1930s French intelligence archives in occupied Paris, documents seized after the fall of France. Among them were code names, payment logs, and correspondence from the Bureau du Chiffre. One name appeared repeatedly, Asche. The payments were traced through intermediaries back to a German bank account, his account. They came for him at dawn. There was no warning, no time to flee. He was taken from his apartment in silence, his hands shaking too badly to dress himself. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the car drove away. He would never return. The interrogations lasted for weeks. He was moved between Gestapo offices in Berlin and Salzburg, questioned, beaten, denied food. The men who questioned him knew exactly what they had: the spy who had betrayed Enigma, the one whose stolen papers had given the Allies a weapon the Reich could never defeat. But the Gestapo also knew something else. Revealing that Enigma had been compromised could destroy what remained of German confidence. So they kept his case secret. In early 1945, as the Allies closed in, the files of Asche were sealed. Hans-Thilo Schmidt was executed quietly, his death recorded under another name. There was no trial, no verdict, no grave. In the end, the spy who had lived two lives vanished as he had lived, in silence. The Abwehr never spoke his name again. His brother, General Rudolf Schmidt, was arrested soon after on suspicion of disloyalty. Two brothers, one a general, one a traitor, both crushed by the same machine they had served. The Nazis thought they had erased him. They were wrong. His secrets had already crossed the channel and lived on in the hands of those who would finish the war he had helped shape from the shadows. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was a graveyard of nations and secrets. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the victors were beginning to piece together the unseen war, the shadow conflict of spies, codes, and betrayals that had shaped every battle. Among the files scattered through abandoned German ministries, Allied investigators began to uncover fragments of a mystery, reports from the Abwehr, interrogation records from the Gestapo, and a name that appeared again and again in cryptic notes: Asche. It took years for the truth to emerge. In 1949, French intelligence finally declassified portions of its wartime archives. Inside was a quiet revelation: Asche was Hans-Thilo Schmidt, a mid-level cipher clerk in Berlin who had supplied French intelligence with the Enigma manuals in the early 1930s. For the first time, historians could see the full chain, from Schmidt's stolen documents to the Polish mathematicians who cracked the first Enigma codes, to the British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park who built machines capable of deciphering the rest. The war's greatest intelligence victory had begun not with a mathematician or a soldier, but with a disillusioned German bureaucrat. In London, when the files were reviewed by former Bletchley staff, the reaction was one of stunned respect. Alan Turing himself had once remarked that the Polish breakthroughs had given the Allies a head start of incalculable value. Now, they understood that those breakthroughs would never have been possible without Schmidt's stolen manuals. His betrayal had made possible the decoding of thousands of German transmissions, troop movements, submarine positions, supply routes. Those deciphered messages shortened the war, saved convoys, and cost the Reich victories it might otherwise have won. Yet Schmidt received no honors, no monuments, not even a grave. His name was buried for decades beneath layers of silence, partly to protect intelligence methods, partly because his story was too uncomfortable. To celebrate him was to acknowledge that one of Germany's greatest defeats had begun with a German's own conscience. The Allies had won with his help, but history rarely rewards the traitor, no matter his cause. His brother, General Rudolf Schmidt, learned the truth only after the war, while held by the Allies. When questioned about Hans-Thilo, he sat for a long time before answering. He was not a spy, he said softly. He was a man who saw what Germany had become, and chose not to be part of it. The words were recorded in a military transcript and then forgotten. In later years, scholars pieced together his legacy from fragments, interrogation records, French intelligence reports, and the testimonies of Gustav Bertrand and Marion Rejewski. Together, they painted the portrait of a man who had lived and died in moral ambiguity, a traitor to his country, but a hero to history. His betrayal of the Reich had been an act of defiance. One born not of ideology, but of despair and decency entwined. Today, his name appears only briefly in books about Enigma, often a footnote beneath the triumphs of codebreakers and mathematicians. But his impact lingers quietly in every decoded message, every victory that came from a signal intercepted in time. He was the first domino in a chain that stretched from Berlin to Warsaw, from Paris to London, from a single act of treason to the salvation of millions. If you visit the memorial at Bletchley Park, you won't find his likeness there. But perhaps you can still imagine him, a tired man in a gray uniform, sitting at his desk late at night, copying pages by lamplight, aware that discovery meant death. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was something rarer, a man who saw evil rising in his own house and decided, quietly and alone, to strike at it from within. The Nazis never suspected him. The Allies never met him. But between them, Hans-Thilo Schmidt changed the course of the war, not with a weapon, but with a choice.